Jackson Square. Welcome to New Orleans. I hope your stay in our enchanted city is magical. Step with me into the liminal space of this swampy city and feel the spirits of all who came before rushing past you. This tour dabs into the deep, so know that your party will resume. But first you must pay homage to the circumstances, both happy and wrenchingly sad, that built the Crescent City. We were colonized more than 300 years ago, in 1718, and this site on Earth has been a public square since shortly after that time. It was originally designated in the city plans in 1721 by engineer Pierre Leblanc de la Tour and his assistant Adrien de Poget. St. Louis Cathedral stands tall above the 2.5-acre open square, magically looming and gleaming white like a cartoon castle. The Cabildo is to its left and the Presbytere is to its right, both with buildings of Spanish colonial architecture topped with French mansard-style roofs, beacons of the diversity and mixture of the city they were planted in. In the distance, beyond the levee, you may be able to see the ships managing the curve of the Mississippi River, also towering above the city. Café du Monde is tucked into its corner, the coffee and chicory a constant comforting mainstay of the center of Old New Orleans since 1862. Jackson Square is the focal point of many New Orleans visits, and the formal gardens, photo-worthy scenes, and historical weight deserve the perpetual pilgrimages of partying patrons. And that was always the plan of Leblanc, as noted by the Historic New Orleans Collection. In his treatise on the elements of fortification, engineer and architect Mr. Leblanc observed that a large and spacious place d'armes is more agreeable than a small one. It is an ornament for the town. Moreover, the principal buildings, like the Great Church, the Town Hall, the Government House, or the House of the Governor, ordinarily have their principal doorway on the place d'armes. All of this attracts there a large concourse of people. It ought to have enough space to be adequate for all that without difficulty. This site has indeed been the concourse of the people, location of public punishment, celebrations, and holiday parades throughout the centuries. Some of the significant events that have happened in this space where you stand today are the transfer of Louisiana from France to Spain in the 1760s, and the transfer back to France just before the Louisiana Purchase was signed in the Cabildo building in 1803. The site of the Triumphal Arch built for General Lafayette in 1825. A large muster meeting held by Andrew Jackson during the Battle of New Orleans in 1814. The reception of Henry Clay in 1842. The reception of General Taylor in 1847. The reception of Pope John Paul II in 1987. In 2020, the COVID-19 quarantine caused the square to be abnormally desolate until the Black Lives Matter protests and the Take 'em Down NOLA movement to remove Confederate statues from our public streets brought crowds to once again make use of the prominent public space to voice their concerns. While this has been a public square for more than 300 years, much of this scene has not changed in more than 150 years. But some of it has not changed for thousands of years. Beyond Café du Monde, where the French market sits, is the possible site of Bulbancha, or Place of Many Tongues, in a Choctaw dialect. Bulbancha was a seasonal trading post where Native Americans of many tribes for hundreds of miles met to exchange goods and ideas, using a common language derived from Choctaw. Pre-colonial times shaped the ethos of our current city, as we are still a location for seasonal trading of inhibitions and cultural ideas. Can you feel the spirits of our ancestors guiding your journey today? While the open square is a constant of colonial New Orleans, it was known as Plaza d'Armas, Place d'Armes, and the parade ground before becoming Jackson Square in 1851. Andrew Jackson rears over the gardens in his permanent equestrian pose. This area was dedicated to the city's hero of the Battle of New Orleans, ignoring his dishonorable role in the Trail of Tears by the Baroness Pontalba in the mid-1800s. During this time, the cathedral underwent a major renovation into the church we know today. The red brick Pontalba buildings were built on either side of the public square, and the lacy ironwork the French Quarter is now known for took over the design of the neighborhood. Jackson tips his hat toward the upper Pontalba. I'll tell you a secret. My mom, a native of this town, told me that he was tipping his hat because the lady whose services he preferred for comfort, i.e. his favorite sex worker, lived in that direction. This seems to be an offshoot of the myth often told by tour guides about the Baroness Pontalba and her secret love affair with Jackson that led to the permanent pose, which has seemingly evolved into a tale about the Baroness's questionable mixed race and a desire for a permanent out of respect when it wasn't socially allowed. The Baroness's life is riddled with interesting tales without the embellishments, as her marriage was not a happy one, her murder was attempted, and she is considered by some to be the first woman architect in the United States because of her contribution of the Pontalba apartment buildings. It is said she rejected all plans and ultimately designed the buildings herself, albeit without credit. She was also the patron responsible for adding this monument to New Orleans, and her father, Don Almonaster, is the patron responsible for the cathedral building you see behind it. Clark Mills is the sculptor, and his Jackson was the first American equestrian statue. Hoof position in equestrian monuments is sometimes considered standard, but rearing with both hooves off the ground usually means that the rider died in battle. Jackson died of yellow fever before the statue was complete. Luckily, Clark Mills, the sculptor of this statue, provided an explanation at the statue's dedication on February 9, 1856. He is quoted in the Times-Picayune. General Jackson is here as he appeared on the 8th of January 41 years ago. He has advanced to the center of the line in the act of review, the lines having come to present arms as a salute to their commander, who is acknowledging it by raising his chapeau, according to the military etiquette of the day. His restive horse, anticipating the next move, attempts to dash down the line. The bridle hand of the dauntless hero being turned under shows that he is restraining the horse, whose open mouth and curved neck indicate that he is feeling the bit. I have thought this explanation necessary, as there are many critics who profess to not understand the conception of the artist. The statue is depicting the muster meeting held by Jackson in this place during the Battle of New Orleans. Mills' statue is significant not because of the subject, but because of the engineering feat he accomplished with it. He was self-taught both in engineering and metallurgy. The unbalanced metal statue, which stands without supports, is the first of its kind. No one before Mills was able to balance a heavy metal cast without some form of support before. The inscription, "The Union must and shall be preserved," an actual quote of Jackson, was added to both sides of the monument by Union troops occupying New Orleans during the Civil War. The Pontalba apartment buildings flank the green space with the original ironwork of the French Quarter on 2 levels. Ironwork on buildings is not unique to the French Quarter of New Orleans. The history of metallurgy is deep and spans continents. However, the vast amount of ironwork in the small neighborhood of the French Quarter, 12 square blocks in total, is unique. There's no place on earth when ironwork on as many buildings in such a small area, and much of this ironwork appeared during the same period. While it seems to be a forgotten part of our history today, we rediscover that much of the ironwork in the French Quarter was beautifully wrought by enslaved people during the antebellum days. In his book, Negro Ironworkers of Louisiana, 1718 through 1900, Marcus Christian reminds us about this forgotten fact. Christian points to histories written by Lyle Saxon and Grace King before the 1930s, which did not shy away from the reliance on the work of the enslaved. He points to the developed art of metalworking on the continent of Africa prior to colonization as a source of the expertise. After the 1930s, history writers scoff at the notion that enslaved humans were responsible for the graceful artwork of the iron in the French Quarter. Some claim that the ironwork was all imported from Seville during this time. The 1938 New Orleans City Guide specifically claims that the ironwork could not have been done in New Orleans, as there are no deposits of iron ore nearby. But Christian helpfully reminds us that while the iron ore was imported, and the knowledge of the craftsmen who pounded it was likely also imported, the finished product was native-born. Christian also cites the roles of freemen of color, blacksmiths in New Orleans via the directory information, and the federal census showing men in New Orleans whose occupation was blacksmith compared to the slave registers to prove his point. That another of the defining aspects of this city was built primarily not by free artisans and laborers, but forced via the hands of enslaved humans. However, Christian does not point out the symbolism embedded in the designs of the wrought iron that reveal this fact as clearly as the smell of fresh coffee and sour liquor permeates the square. The sacred West African Adinkra symbols are on display in the graceful curves, allowing our enslaved ancestors to continue to protect the city centuries later. In the ironwork wrapping the Pontalba buildings, you can find the monogram AP for Almonaster and Pontalba. But if you look carefully, you can also find Adinkra symbols hidden in the ironwork, particularly the one meaning that which shall not be burned, as these buildings were built after the two great fires, but still within the memories of the living, including this symbol seems particularly significant. You're immersed in Victorian garden-esque landscaping. According to the Cultural Landscape Foundation, this style is defined by colorful gardens, ornately curved cast iron, and allowing plants to grow in their natural form instead of pruning. However, the term garden-esque refers to a plan that is not mistakable for a natural growth pattern. Victorian garden-esque was popular in the mid to late 1800s, making Jackson Square a cutting-edge example of the style. The iron fence surrounding the square and the renovation into the formal garden was designed by Louis Pillet in 1851. His work included planting grass, trees, and shrubs, adding the marble statues of the four seasons found in the four corners of the park, and relocating the fountain to St. Anthony's Garden behind the cathedral. Originally, the design for the square was simple, with sycamore trees planted along diagonal paths. The central fountain was not installed until 1836, but it was removed when the Jackson statue was added to the center of the square. Very little has changed since Pillet completed his renovations, as is confirmed by images from the 1860s. In 1895, another fountain was added that was removed. The current fountain was added in 1960 to honor French President Charles de Gaulle, who visited. In the early 1970s, Carlos Cascio, a landscape architect from Plaquemine, renovated Jackson Square, removing car access for 3 streets surrounding the square and transforming it into the pedestrian paradise we know. New Orleans is sometimes called the city that care forgot, and while this attitude can be the most appealing thing about our culture, it can also lead to devastating circumstances. In 2023, one of the 150-year-old oak trees in the square, suffering from rot and disease, collapsed on a person enjoying the scenery. In an aerial image from 2022, you can see the doomed tree clearly. Maintaining this central hub of tourism in a city reliant on the visits of tourists was seemingly forgotten. Many souls have passed through this small piece of earth, and now you know about a few and become one of them. Take these stories with you as you explore the city. Your knowledge is a relieving balm that you can share with others you encounter, never ruining the magic of New Orleans, but adding layers to understand it more clearly. Thank you for joining me on this tour of Jackson Square in New Orleans. Please enjoy your stay in our beloved city. If you enjoyed this tour, please give it a rating so that others can enjoy it too. If you have ideas for future topics or tours, please send me a message or email me at fromthedeepgiftshop@gmail.com.